introduce next speaker. Okay, please prepare. As I mentioned, I have an interesting, sweet memory of when I stayed in Maastricht more than 20 years ago. I now remember one bad memory. I'd like to share this. A problem with a bee. Once I was outside of the Maastricht city, then I took ice cream. Yeah? Then later I had a problem with bee. Too much bee. I didn't know so many bees outside in Netherlands because of so many wonderful flowers, sweet flowers. That's a problem in such a warm day. But in other hand, such a bee, even like a humble bee, can inspire us to advance the science. I think the next lecture will be such kind of evidence, inspired by humble bee. Yeah? We'll see what happens. Now my pleasure to introduce the next speaker. Matthias Beckmann from University of Jena, Germany. Okay, please.
Good morning. I'd like to introduce a random walk evacuation game. And this game features a stochastic component and requires some input from a player. So the outline of my talk is, I will start with the basic game. I show how to compute optimal strategies. We will see some results. And as a last point, we will show that in any dimension, this game is the underlying random block is recurrent, and this has important consequences for our game. So, what are the rules for our game? We have a board, and this board consists of several smaller cells. A particle or a token is moving on this board, and it can move into neighboring cells. The goal is that this particle reaches a certain evacuation cell. If it reaches such a cell, the game is over, and we can also have more than one evacuation cell. We have time running. Time passes in discrete steps, and in every step, the token moves into one of the neighboring cells. So until now, we had no input from our player. So what can our player do? In every time step, he can block the access to one of the neighboring cells. And these blockades are only there in the time step where they are placed. I will show it with an example later on. And our task is, how should we place these blockades to make the particle reach the evacuation cell the fastest? So this problem appeared in a discussion with Ingo Althofer when he told me that a small bumblebee got lost in his room, and he tried to motivate it to move out of the room by blocking its flight path with a newspaper. So for my example, I modeled the living room of Ingo Althofer with a 5x5 board, and our bumblebee sits in the middle of the room, and now we want to get it out of the window. The window is the blue structure, and the evacuation cell is this gray cell on top, and it should model outdoors where we want the bumblebee to move. So we place our newspaper in the southern position of the bumblebee, and now there are 3 neighboring cells left, west, north, and east, and the bumblebee can move into each of the neighboring cells with probability 1/3. For example, it moves to the left. The blockade we placed in the south is now deleted, and this would be the initial position for our next step. And then maybe we place a blockade on the western point, and so on, until we finally reach outdoors. So, as applications for the model, I said we can use it to model the evacuation of a bumblebee out of a room, or maybe something else. Random walks are also used for diffusion in crystals, so maybe we can model a directed diffusion where we control where an impurity in a crystal has to go. Or, as a third example, blockades to steer crowds. Imagine we have a rioting crowd after a soccer match starting at the stadium, and we want them to move to the train station. So maybe we have this city. This is a part of Barcelona, where the city consists of several square blocks, and we can model this by a board we have just seen. We take the intersection of two streets and say this is a cell, and the blockades are employed by a police team, for example, which can be placed on such a street, and then our rioting crowd says no, we don't want to go there, and move into one of the other three directions. So we want to call such a game a microcontrol game. This is a more philosophical definition. A microcontrol game is a game where we have a small input from a player, and then a substantial, larger random part happens. So in this case, we place a blockade. This is our small control input, and then a random walk happens, and the particle moves into one of the three neighboring cells. Maybe we can find some other games with microcontrol. I thought of pinball. Pinball, maybe everyone knows this game. There's a board, and on the bottom of the board there are two flippers which can kick a steel ball up. And we only have control of the steel ball when it's close to the flippers. And during in the other time, the ball is in the upper part of the board. We have no control over it. And we would have to call this also a microcontrol game. Or racket games. These are games where you have a racket and can kick a ball somewhere, for example, pong or tennis simulators. And here our control part is how we can hold our racket, and the random part which happens is the ball moving, and maybe it's influenced by wind in case of the tennis simulator. Or yesterday we have seen the stock market games with diffusion control, which Ingo Althoff presented, where we could decide if we buy the high variance stock or the low variance stock, and after that we have no control for a time step, and maybe monetary units are gained or lost. So how should we compute optimal strategies? An optimal strategy is a strategy which reaches the evacuation cell the fastest. So we let AYJ be the expected time until such an evacuation cell is reached if an optimal strategy is employed. And then an equation system has to hold. AYJ is the minimum of the cases where we place a northern blockade, an eastern blockade, a southern blockade, or a western blockade. And for an inner node, for an inner cell, IJ, it would look like this. And it's a bit different if we are on the border of the board. There our movement options are limited, and in the top left corner it would only look like this, because we have only two cells where we can go. Yes, and this is a nonlinear equation system. We can show that these Aij are well defined, so they exist and they are unique. And we can solve this equation system numerically. If we want to know how we should place our blockades, we just memorize where the minimum was reached. It's important to know that the optimal strategy does not have to be unique, even though the Aij are unique. This is the case when we have symmetric boards. And I will give some examples. here we have modeled a living room. Our window is represented by 4 cells, so it's a bit larger than last time. And this is the optimal strategy derived from solving the nonlinear equation system. So in the most part, we place our blockade in the south, and it can only go up, right, left. And here we will block west, we block east, and there are also some parts over here where we can block east or west.
The total grid is 20 times 20 or?
Yes, 20 times 20. Of course, we can also have 2 evacuation cells. I have one on the northern part and one in the eastern part. And now the optimal strategy looks a bit more complicated, but if we take it apart, we can think of separating the board along the diagonal, and in the right part, it's like we only have one evacuation cell here and try to motivate our bumblebee to go to this evacuation cell, and in this part, we try to get it to the upper evacuation cell. And of course, we do not have to only take a look at rectangular boards. We can also look at more complicated shapes. This is my children's playing room. Look like this. And here we can see a bit different strategy. On the first 2 pictures, it was like we blocked the cell which is the most distant from the closest evacuation cell. But now we have to go around the corner, and our strategy looks a bit more complicated. So we only took a look at what happens if we can deploy 1 blockade, and now we want to allow the placement of 1 or 2 blockades. We can compute the optimal strategies like we did before. We just have to include our additional moves into the equation system, and it would look like this. These are the 6 possible placements of 2 blockades, and then we have the terms for single blockades. And then, for example, it would look like this. We have a very simple room, an evacuation cell is on top, and we see that on almost every cell we would use our 2 blockades. And here we would use them like this, and in the right part we would use them like this. And in the middle part, in the violet line, the optimal strategy is not unique. We can either block the western part, the western cell or the southern cell, or the eastern cell and the southern cell. So after looking at several examples, we want to know how many blockades should be placed, and we can easily show that we always should place the maximum allowed number of blockades. For another part, the time taken until evacuation was very important, because we want to know how fast can we get something to the evacuation cell. So we want to look at a special class of rooms, which we have already seen. They are square rooms and have a single evacuation cell placed on top. And now we want to take a look at how the average number of steps until evacuation grows with growing board size. So we define it as the average over all our AIJs, and we do the same for a model with 1 or 2 blockades and 1, 2, or 3 blockades. Then we observe it by solving the equation systems for these boards, and the first two results are numerically, and the third one is derived by hand. And we see that the average time is linear in the board size. So here we can make our bumblebee move into one cell in the cell we want to, because we place 3 blockades. There's only one neighboring cell left. This is what makes it very easy to derive the time. So we took a look at the time until evacuation, and a property of a random walk connected to the time until we reach the evacuation cell is recurrence. We take a look at the case for the simple random walk. So the simple random walk, there are no blockades, and the random walk could move into all of its neighboring cells with equal property. So we call a random walk recurrent if it returns to the origin with probability 1. And for this there is an important theorem of Pauli that says in 2 dimensions, so a board or 1 dimension, the particle will always return to the origin, but if we take a look at a 3-dimensional board or a 4-dimensional board, the probability of returning to the origin is lower than 1. So the particle might get lost if the dimension is big enough. This is a problem for our model, because it's possible that if the dimension is very high and we are not allowed to place many blockades, the particle might get lost and we can never reach the evacuation cell by blocking the path of the particle. So we will another paraphrase for this theorem is that the drunk walker always finds his way home and the drunk bird gets lost. So the drunk walker moves on a 2-dimensional board and he will always find home, but the drunk bird moves in a 3-dimensional space. It gets lost. It's a sentence often told in statistics classes, and it was coined by Kakutani. So the consequences for the evacuation game is we have to prove that the random walk is recurrent, and at first we take a look at it if we only use 1 blockade, and if we can show this, then we know that 1 blockade is always enough to guide the particle back home on the evacuation cell. Yeah, as an additional information, if we take a look at boards with finite number of cells, we can show that easily that it will always find its way back home if all the cells are connected. So we take a look at infinite boards with dimension n. They prove to be a bit problematic numerically because there's an infinite number of variables, so we have problems solving this. So we took a look at finite boards. There's an evacuation cell in the middle, and we let it take 1 step out and then try to guide it back to the central evacuation cell. And we took a look at this for different board sizes. And this is an example for a 23 times 23 board, and we observe that in the circular area we always block the most distant cell, and we make this observation for all board sizes. There's always a circular area which reaches until the boundary where we block the most distant cell. So we formulate for the infinite board a strategy which is exactly our observation for the circular area. It says we block always the neighboring cell which is most distant from the origin. In this area we will block the northern part, here we will block the eastern part, the western part, and if there are more than one cell which fulfill the property, we can break the tie arbitrarily. So this is because of symmetry. And then we examine the recurrence property for this strategy. We have not shown that this strategy is optimal, but if it's fulfilled for this simple strategy, it will also hold for the optimal strategy on the infinite board. And then some experimental results at first. We have the dimension here, and we observe that the random walk will always return to the origin. And for comparison, I have included a number for the model without blockades. And of course, the expected time grows very fast with the dimension, expected time until return. We have also shown that this property holds for dimension 2 and theoretically, and the step to 3, 4 and higher dimensions is very easy, but it's not done yet. So conclusions, the random walk associated with the one blockade game in the infinite space is recurrent in all dimensions, and so the drunk bird will always find its way home if we only use a single blockade. And work in progress is a formal proof for the recurrence property. It's not done completely yet. And from observations, we can tell that the expected time until evacuation is linear in the distance to the evacuation cell, but it's not proven yet. And I'm also looking for a strategy paradox. If we take a look back at the strategies, they look very simple, and most of the time it was correct to block the cell which was most distinct. There were some exceptions, for example, on the L-shaped board. And if we are close to the boundary, and thanks for your attention.
Now time for discussion, please. Okay.
You optimized for minimum time.
Yes.
In real world, it might be interesting to optimize to get a high probability in a finite time. Will this be the same strategy? For example, I want the key get out within 5 minutes.
Okay, so you...
And I want to have a high probability that in the following lecture the key is out.
I haven't taken a look at this, but I can imagine that the strategy looks very similar, at least.
I don't think so, because I think to block in the West is not a good idea because it can become much worse. So my feeling is the strategy would be to block always, if the window is there, to block always on this side.
Okay.
But I don't know. My feeling is it's not the same problem.
Well, very interesting point, I think, and you try to find paradoxes.
Yes.
And I think his proposal may help. That you have situations where in your criterion it is best to do this, and in your criterion it is better to do something else. Especially when time is very short.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I will definitely take a look at this.
Yeah. Also, in the bumblebee problem, you had you came up with values for the expected evacuation time.
Yes.
Were those analytically derived, or was that just through simulation?
The average time.
Yes.
The first two were by the simulation, and the third was done by hand. Because the third one is not random anymore. We can force it to move one cell, and then it's the time until evacuation is the Manhattan distance.
And which was the third one? I'm sorry.
3 blockades.
Oh, yeah.
But the first 2 were simulated.
Any other? Okay.
It would change the rules slightly to allow the player not to blockade anything, and then maybe for each time step you choose between the 4 directions and not doing anything. And then what you try to minimize is not the total time, but it's the total use of blockade. Do you think that it would be optimal sometimes to pass through turn?
Yes. Yes. I haven't taken a look at this, but from my intuition, I would say there will be passes. Yes.
You also have a random probability equal to each of the 4 squares, adjacent squares. In reality, a bumblebee moving from one square to another square is more likely to continue in the same direction that it's going. So you could now start adding probability distributions.
Yes, that's an interesting problem. We can model this too with the evacuation system. I briefly took a look at this. So if it's flying in one direction, the probability is higher to keep on flying in this direction.
I don't think the maths is that much more difficult than that as you've got there.
Yes, it's very similar.
Weights are now added to the long equation.
Yes.
My experience with the common house fly is that it actually is completely random. Impossible to catch.
My experience with bumblebees, the best way to get them out is not block them, but swap them.
No.
Next week.
I can imagine hitting this bumblebee with a sock full of Lego bricks, to be honest. Anyway, yesterday. Yeah, a little lemma went by about if you have more blockade opportunities, the expected time is shorter. I sort of feel that ought to be simple to prove, but I can't. I've tried doing it while you were talking, couldn't do it. So is it a very simple, like strategy stealing, subset argument?
We go back to the equation system.
Yeah.
And order the neighboring cells A1, A2, A3, A4, and the expected time in A1 is smaller than in A2, it's smaller than A3. And then we do some simplifications, and it boils down to the argument that the average of the best 3 is smaller than the average of the best 4.
So I'm just going to put my blockades on the squares that have the longest expected time to the exit. Yeah. To reduce the average of the rest.
That's not how the argument for showing that putting the maximum number of blockades is optimal. We just have to take a look at the equation system.
Okay.
And then we do some simplifications of the terms inside the minimum operator, and then it boils down to the argument showing that the average of the best 3 is smaller than the average of the best 4. Or
Okay.
Any others? Interesting to see observation by Mr. Takutani. Like bird eventually come back to home, but I don't believe in Japan. Interesting. If not, last week we finished this. Thank you.